The power grid in our Michigan suburb failed at 9:00 p.m., plunging the entire street into a freezing, absolute black. I wasn't going to check on the house next door until I saw the flashlight beam frantically hitting my living room window. When I finally forced the side door open, my 70-year-old neighbor wasn't just cold. She grabbed my wrist with a grip so tight it left bruises, pulled me into her freezing hallway, and whispered the words that would eventually tear an entire family apart. "Please stay until morning. If I'm alone when she gets back, she'll make me sign it." My name is Elena. I am 34 years old, and I run an independent bookkeeping and forensic accounting business from my home. I bought this small, unassuming house at the end of a dead-end street, specifically because I wanted total peace. I spent my days analyzing spreadsheets, tracking missing funds, and reading the fine print that other people ignore. Numbers do not lie, and they do not manipulate you. People do. I had learned that lesson the hard way, and it cost me my entire 20s to escape it. My own family had been a masterclass in financial and emotional manipulation. My older brother was the golden child, and my parents used my credit, my savings, and my relentless sense of duty to fund his endless string of failed businesses. When I finally said no, I wasn't just cut off. I was publicly smeared, blamed for everything that went wrong, and left with thousands in debt that took years to clear. I rebuilt my life, brick by brick, in this quiet town. I promised myself I would never let another manipulator blindside me. Because of my past, I have a very low tolerance for people who wear their supposed virtues like a pageant sash. That is exactly what my neighbor's daughter, Brenda, did. The she my neighbor was terrified of was Brenda, a woman who had moved her mother, Mrs. Henderson, into the house next door 2 years ago. To the rest of the subdivision, Brenda was the ultimate devoted daughter. She drove a pristine white luxury SUV, wore expensive neutral-toned cashmere, and dominated every neighborhood conversation with tales of her sacrifices. Brenda never actually lived in the house. She lived in a massive estate, 3 towns over, but visited just enough to maintain her perfect public image. She would attend the homeowners association meetings, sighing heavily as she talked about the crushing burden of caring for a declining, difficult parent. She painted Mrs. Henderson as a combative, confused woman suffering from early-stage dementia. The neighbors ate it up. They praised Brenda. They brought her casseroles. They called her a saint for dealing with such a tragic, heavy responsibility. But I analyze patterns for a living, and Brenda's pattern was entirely superficial. I noticed the small, quiet discrepancies that no one else cared to look for. Brenda's luxury car would idle in the driveway for exactly 10 minutes before speeding off hardly enough time to administer medication, let alone provide actual care. The groceries she left on the porch were heavy, industrial-sized canned goods that an arthritic 70-year-old woman could never realistically open or cook on her own. It was a performance designed for an audience of neighbors. On the rare occasions Mrs. Henderson was allowed to step out onto her front porch, she didn't look like a woman losing her mind. She looked like a prisoner. She was always impeccably dressed in old-fashioned, tidy clothing, but her eyes darted nervously around the street, constantly checking the driveway. Whenever I waved to her from my garden, she would offer a small, polite smile before retreating inside like a frightened bird. It wasn't dementia. It was fear. It was the exact same hypervigilance I used to feel when my brother was in the room. I had tried to introduce myself formally a few times, but Brenda always intercepted me. She would step between me and her mother, flashing a bright, aggressive smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom gets easily overwhelmed," Brenda would say, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We have to keep her environment strictly controlled for her own safety. You understand, don't you?" Elena, I understood perfectly. I understood that Brenda was isolating her mother, building an invisible wall around the house, and daring anyone to question the devoted daughter narrative. The winter storm hit hard on a Tuesday evening. The temperature plummeted to 12 degrees within an hour, and the wind howled through the bare trees. At 9:00 p.m., a transformer blew down the main road, and the entire neighborhood went pitch black. My phone buzzed constantly, with the local text thread neighbors checking in, sharing updates about generators and firewood. But the house next door remained completely dark and completely silent. No emergency lights flickered on. No flashlight beam moved across the windows. Just a heavy, dead silence. I tried to brush it off. I told myself Brenda must have picked her up before the storm hit, taking her back to the large estate, where it was safe and warm, but an unsettling knot tightened in my stomach. I walked to my kitchen window and stared across the fence. That was when I saw it. A faint, frantic, flashing light hitting the side of my house. It was weak, turning on and off in rapid, desperate bursts, coming from the ground floor bedroom window of Mrs. Henderson's supposedly empty house. I threw on my heavy winter parka, grabbed my high-powered LED camping lantern, and stuffed a pair of heavy work gloves into my pockets. I trudged through the knee-deep snow, fighting against the biting wind that whipped across my face. I reached Mrs. Henderson's front porch and pounded on the heavy oak door. "Mrs. Henderson, it's Elena. Are you okay?" I yelled over the storm. There was no answer. I grabbed the doorknob, expecting it to be locked. But I wasn't prepared for what I actually found. The deadbolt wasn't engaged. Instead, there was a brand new, heavy-duty industrial padlock secured to a metal hasp that had been freshly drilled into the exterior frame. Someone had intentionally locked a frail, elderly woman inside the house from the outside. You don't lock someone in for their safety. You lock them in so they cannot escape. My heart slammed against my ribs. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. This wasn't just neglect. This was calculated. Physical confinement during a severe winter freeze. I didn't waste time knocking again. I bypassed the porch and waded through the deep snowdrifts to the side of the house, shining my lantern through the glass panes of the mudroom door. The house was entirely stripped of warmth. The plush hallway runner was gone. The decorative side tables were gone. I grabbed a decorative landscaping brick from the frozen garden border, smashed the glass pane near the lock, reached my gloved hand inside, and flipped the interior deadbolt. The cold air inside the house was somehow worse than the storm outside. It felt stagnant and damp, completely devoid of any residual heat. The furnace hadn't been running for days. I moved my lantern beam across the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. The room was empty. The antique sofa, the television, the bookshelves, everything had been removed. In the center of the bare hardwood floor sat a single folding chair, and beside it, huddled under a thin decorative throw blanket, was Mrs. Henderson. She was shivering violently. Her lips tinged blue. Her fragile hands clutching a thick manila folder to her chest. She looked up at me, blinded by the lantern light, and flinched as if expecting a blow. I dropped to my knees, taking off my heavy parka and wrapping it tightly around her trembling shoulders. "I've got you," I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the rage boiling in my veins. "We are going to my house right now. I have a fire going. You are safe." I tried to lift her gently, but she planted her feet on the icy floor, refusing to move. She dug her fingers into my wrist with a desperate, surprising strength. Her eyes were painfully lucid, completely destroying the narrative of a confused woman losing her grip on reality. She wasn't disoriented. She was terrified. She pulled me down closer to her face, her breath forming small white clouds in the freezing air, and whispered the words that completely changed the trajectory of the night. "Please stay until morning," she begged, her voice cracking with cold and exhaustion. "If I leave this house, Brenda will claim I abandoned the property. She's coming at dawn with the notary. I can't let her take the deed. If I leave, she wins." She shoved the manila folder into my hands. The papers inside weren't old letters or confused scribbles, even in the dim light. My forensic accountant brain immediately recognized the bold, legal formatting of an absolute power of attorney and a quitclaim deed. Brenda wasn't just neglecting her mother for convenience. She was systematically staging a narrative of legal incompetence. She was freezing her out, isolating her from the world, and breaking her spirit just enough to force her to sign away a property that had been in their family for 4 generations. Brenda had stripped the house of furniture to make it look abandoned. She locked the door from the outside to ensure her mother couldn't seek help or leave a paper trail of her sanity. The old wound in my chest, the betrayal I had suffered from my own family, tore right open. I knew exactly what Brenda was banking on. She assumed her mother was too weak to fight, too isolated to find an ally, and too embarrassed by the abuse to expose her own daughter to the judgmental eyes of the neighborhood. She assumed there would be no witnesses to this quiet, sterile cruelty. She assumed the storm would be the perfect cover for her final move. She assumed she had already won. I looked down at Mrs. Henderson, took the frozen, trembling legal documents from her hands, and slid them deep into the inner pocket of my sweater. He felt a cold, absolute calm wash over me. I wasn't just going to stay until morning. I was going to dismantle Brenda's perfect, pristine life, piece by piece. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her quietly, pulling up the folding chair and sitting right beside her in the dark. "We are going to wait for her together." We sat in that pitch-black, freezing living room for 7 hours. The silence was broken only by the howling wind outside and the steady ticking of my wristwatch. I wrapped Mrs. Henderson in 3 heavy thermal blankets I had retrieved from my house, fed her hot tea from a thermos, and reviewed every single page in that manila folder by the light of a small penlight. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the snow outside a pale, icy blue, I had a complete understanding of Brenda's financial trap. At exactly 6:15 a.m., the storm broke, leaving a deadly, quiet chill over the neighborhood. The heavy crunch of tires echoed in the snowy driveway. I heard the engine of Brenda's luxury SUV shut off. Footsteps marched up the wooden porch, Steps. The heavy-duty padlock unlocked with a loud, metallic clank that sent a visible shudder through Mrs. Henderson's frail body. The door swung open, letting in a blast of morning air, and Brenda's sharp, impatient voice echoed through the empty hallway, entirely devoid of her usual public sweetness. "All right, Mom," Brenda snapped, her heavy boots stomping onto the hardwood floor. "Are you finally miserable enough to sign the damn papers? Or do we need to do another night in the dark until you learn how things work now?" She rounded the corner into the living room, holding a clipboard and flanked by a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit, the notary, but the smug, victorious smile on her face vanished instantly when my high-powered lantern clicked on, blinding them both, illuminating the fact that her mother was no longer alone. Brenda Froze. The blinding light hit her right in the eyes, stripping away the confident, affluent persona she wore so perfectly. For a split second, he saw Rav, unfiltered panic, cross her face. The clipboard in her hands dropped slightly, and the cheap-suited notary behind her shifted his weight, looking suddenly very aware that this wasn't the routine morning appointment he had been promised. I didn't say a word. I just kept the lantern pointed directly at her, waiting for the performance to begin. She recovered faster than I expected. The panic vanished, instantly replaced by the polished, condescending rage of a woman completely unaccustomed to being challenged. "What the hell are you doing in my mother's house?" Brenda demanded, stepping forward and trying to block the notary's view of the barren room. "This is private property. You have absolutely no right to be here. My mother is a very sick woman, and you are trespassing on a highly sensitive family matter." "I didn't break in," I said, my voice deliberately low and steady. "I didn't stand up. I kept my posture relaxed, a stark contrast to her defensive aggression. I came over to check on an elderly woman during a severe winter blackout. A woman I found locked inside an unheated house from the outside, with an industrial padlock. Brenda, I'm pretty sure the fire marshal would have a few interesting things to say about that kind of highly sensitive family matter." The notary choked on his own breath. He was young, likely newly commissioned, and terrified of losing his license. He peered around Brenda's shoulder, his eyes darting from the bare walls to the heavy coats I had wrapped around Mrs. Henderson. "Mom," he stammered, taking a slow step backward toward the mudroom. "You told me your mother was ready to sign the quitclaim deed voluntarily before moving to a care facility. You didn't mention." The house was empty, or freezing. Brenda spun around, her pristine cashmere coat swishing sharply. "She is ready to sign," she hissed through gritted teeth, grabbing his forearm. "She has dementia. She gets confused and wanders, which is why the door was secured for her own protection. It's a temporary measure until I can get her safely transported. Now do your job. Have her sign the document. Stamp it, and I will pay you double the agreed fee right now." The notary forcefully yanked his arm out of her grip. "I am absolutely not notarizing a property transfer under these conditions," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "She is clearly under duress. This environment is unsafe. And frankly, I don't want to be an accessory to whatever this is." He didn't wait for her response. He turned on his heel, practically sprinting out the front door, his boots crunching loudly against the frozen snow as he fled the driveway. Brenda stared after him, her chest heaving with furious, suppressed breaths. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of her expensive SUV idling in the cold outside. When she finally turned back to us, the mask was completely gone. She glared at me, her eyes narrowing into tiny, hateful slits. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? You think you understand what's going on? Because you peeked over the fence. You know nothing. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at her mother, who was still clutching the manila folder tightly against her chest. Do you have any idea the burden she has been? The absolute sacrifice it takes to manage her life. I have put my own family on hold. I have spent thousands managing her medical care, her bills, this stupid, decaying house. I am owed gratitude. I am owed fairness. It is entirely my responsibility to ensure her assets are protected before she loses her mind completely. Protected from whom? I asked quietly, leaning forward in my folding chair. From her. Because according to the financial documents she just showed me, the only person draining her accounts is you. The house is the only asset left. Once she signs that deed, you plan to sell it, pocket the cash, and drop her in a state-run facility funded by Medicare. You aren't protecting her. You are liquidating her. Brenda's face flushed a deep, violent shade of red. The fact that an outsider had read the documents, had seen the exact architecture of her greed, pushed her over the edge. She marched toward me, towering over my chair. This is my inheritance. My father promised it to me before he died. I'm just taking what is legally and morally mine before she squanders it on home nurses or gives it away. She owes me for putting up with her all these years. I owe you nothing, Mrs. Henderson said. Her voice was raspy, damaged by the freezing air, but it possessed a sudden, striking clarity that echoed off the bare walls. It was the first time she had spoken since Brenda entered. Your father left this house to me. He knew exactly what you were. Brenda. He knew you measured love in dollar signs. I stayed quiet because I kept hoping you would change. But I am not signing the house over to you. Never. Brenda stared at her mother, completely devoid of empathy. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh. You don't have a choice. Mom, look around you. You have no furniture. You have no money. You have no phone. You can't even keep the heat on without me paying the utility bill. You are an incompetent, delusional old woman. And by tomorrow afternoon, I will have a judge sign an emergency conservatorship order proving exactly that. You will be removed from this property by force. She turned her venomous gaze back to me. And you, if I see you on this property again, I will have you arrested for trespassing and elder abuse. You moved her documents. You manipulated a confused woman in the middle of the night. Good luck explaining to the sheriff why a stranger is interfering with my mother's estate. She turned, marched out of the room, and slammed the heavy oak door behind her so hard the entire house vibrated. The sound of her SUV speeding away left an oppressive silence in its wake. Mrs. Henderson slumped forward, the adrenaline finally leaving her fragile body. She began to cry, silent tears tracking down her pale cheeks. It was the devastating grief of a mother realizing that her child was not just flawed, but fundamentally dangerous. I stood up, gathered the heavy blankets tighter around her, and gently took her arm. "Come on. We are going to my house. The heat is back on." I brought her into my home, settled her onto my thick living room sofa, and handed her a bowl of hot oatmeal, while she slowly regained her strength. I took the manila folder to my home office. As a forensic accountant, I've spent a decade tracing hidden money, exposing corporate fraud, and unwinding complex financial lies. Brenda thought she was clever, but she had made the classic mistake of every arrogant embezzler she left: a massive, undeniable paper trail. I spread the documents across my mahogany desk. There were bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and the unsigned quitclaim deed. But there was also a trust document Brenda had clearly forgotten to remove. The trust was ironclad. Mrs. Henderson's late husband had explicitly stated that the principal could only be used for her direct living expenses. Brenda, acting as the trustee, had been illegally siphoning funds into an LLC registered under her own husband's name for the past 18 months. But financial fraud takes time to prove in court, and Brenda had promised an emergency conservatorship by tomorrow. We needed a faster, to more immediate leverage point to stop her from weaponizing the police against us. I looked out my office window, directly at the side of Mrs. Henderson's house. Specifically, I looked at the discreet, high-definition security camera mounted under my roofline. I had installed it last year after a series of neighborhood package thefts. Its field of view covered my entire driveway and the side of her house. I pulled up the encrypted hard drive on my computer and scrubbed back to yesterday afternoon. The timestamp read 4:15 p.m., hours before the storm hit. The footage was crystal clear. It showed Brenda's pristine white SUV pulling up. It showed her directing two men to load her mother's furniture into a moving truck. Most importantly, it showed Brenda drilling the metal hasp into the exterior doorframe, snapping the heavy padlock shut, and driving away, leaving her mother locked in a freezing house. I downloaded the footage to a secure flash drive and compiled the bank transfers into a clean, irrefutable spreadsheet. I wasn't just building a defense for Mrs. Henderson. I was building a loaded gun. Brenda wanted to play a game of reputation and legal authority, relying on her perfect image to bulldoze her mother into submission. She believed she controlled the narrative because she was the loudest, most aggressive voice in the room. For the next 3 days, Brenda laid siege to the house. She sent angry, threatening text messages to my phone, somehow obtaining my number from the neighborhood directory. She drove slowly past my property, her eyes glaring from behind the tinted windows of her SUV. She was trying to break our nerve, trying to intimidate me into abandoning Mrs. Henderson. She thought the silence from my end meant we were cowering in fear, paralyzed by her threats of a judge and a sheriff. What Brenda didn't understand was that silence is not always a symptom of fear. Sometimes, silence is the sound of a trap being meticulously set. I didn't block her number, and I didn't respond to her threats. Every abusive text, every voicemail threatening police action, and every slow drive-by was logged, saved, and added to the folder. Let her dig the hole deeper. Let her believe she was holding all the cards. On the 4th morning, the threat finally materialized. I was pouring Mrs. Henderson a cup of coffee when the heavy, authoritative knock echoed through my front hallway. I glanced at the security monitor on my kitchen counter. Standing on my porch was a local sheriff's deputy, and standing right behind him, wearing a somber, deeply concerned expression, was Brenda. She had a thick stack of legal papers clutched to her chest. The past had returned to collect, but this time, I was ready for it. I opened my front door slowly, keeping the chain engaged for a brief moment to assess the situation. The winter morning air swept into the hallway, crisp and biting, mirroring the icy tension radiating from the porch. The sheriff's deputy was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s. His posture relaxed but observant. Brenda stood half a step behind him, clutching her leather binder like a shield. She had swapped her aggressive demeanor for an expression of profound, exhausted sorrow, playing the role of the desperate, heartbroken daughter perfectly. "Good morning, Mum," the deputy said, his voice polite and professional. "I'm Deputy Miller. We received a distress call regarding an elderly woman, a Mrs. Henderson, who was allegedly removed from her legal residence next door. Her daughter here states that you are harboring her against her will, and that her mother suffers from advanced cognitive decline. I need to come inside, verify her safety, and execute a temporary medical conservatorship order that has been signed by a county judge." He gestured toward the paperwork in Brenda's manicured hands. Brenda dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue, releasing a shaky, practiced sigh. "Please, Elena," she pleaded, her voice trembling with artificial vulnerability. "I know you think you were helping during the blackout, but my mother is severely confused. She doesn't understand what she's doing. You are interfering with her critical medical care, and it is tearing our family apart. I just want her safe. I have the legal responsibility to protect her. And you are making this incredibly painful for everyone involved. Just let us in." I looked directly at Brenda, feeling a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. She was using the exact same playbook my brother had used when he wanted to drain my parents' retirement accounts. The weaponization of the word family, the false narrative of protection to mask pure greed, the way she effortlessly shifted the blame onto anyone who dared to question her authority. She was banking on the deputy, taking the path of least resistance, trusting the polished, wealthy woman over the quiet neighbor. "Deputy Miller," I said calmly, unhooking the chain and opening the door wider, though I firmly blocked the threshold with my body. "Mrs. Henderson is indeed here. She is warm. She is fed. And she is perfectly safe. You are more than welcome to step inside and speak with her directly to verify her well-being. However, Brenda is absolutely not crossing my property line. She is a hostile party, and she is not welcome in my home." I stepped back just enough to let the officer pass. Brenda's sorrowful facade cracked instantly, her jaw tightening as she moved to follow the deputy inside. "Excuse me, I am her legally appointed caregiver and her daughter," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "I have a court order signed by a judge giving me temporary guardianship. You do not get to dictate where I go or who I see. This is a family matter, and I demand to be present while the officer speaks to my mother. You are crossing a massive legal boundary. Elena." I raised my hand, stopping her dead in her tracks on the welcome mat. "The only boundary being crossed here is yours," I replied, my tone flat and unyielding. "Your court order is for medical guardianship, not a search warrant for my private residence. You have no legal jurisdiction over my house. If you take one more step onto my hardwood floor, I will press immediate trespassing charges. Wait on the porch." The deputy turned around, looked at Brenda's furious face, and nodded firmly in my direction. "She stays outside," Deputy Miller instructed, shutting the front door in Brenda's face before she could argue further. The heavy click of the latch echoed through the quiet house. I led him into the living room, where Mrs. Henderson was sitting upright on the sofa. She looked completely different from the terrified, freezing woman I had rescued 4 nights ago. She was wearing clean, comfortable clothes. Her posture was straight, and her eyes were sharp. She did not look like a woman losing her grip on reality. The deputy approached her gently, crouching down slightly to be at eye level. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Deputy Miller. Your daughter sent me here. She claims you are confused, and that you were taken from your home without your medication or proper supervision. Can you tell me what day it is, where you are, and why you aren't in your own house right now?" He pulled out a small notepad, ready to document the signs of dementia he had been fully briefed to expect by Brenda. Mrs. Henderson looked at the officer with a calm, piercing dignity. "Today is Saturday. Deputy, I am in the home of my neighbor, Elena, and I am not in my own house because my daughter completely emptied it of furniture, turned off the furnace during a blizzard, and locked the exterior door with an industrial padlock so I could not escape. She is trying to force me to sign a quitclaim deed to my property by freezing me to death. I am not confused. I am a hostage." Deputy Miller stopped writing. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted abruptly. He looked from Mrs. Henderson to me, his brow furrowing in deep concern. This was no longer a routine welfare check on a wandering senior citizen. The allegations Mrs. Henderson just dropped elevated the situation from a civil family dispute to felony elder abuse and unlawful imprisonment. "Ma'am," the deputy said cautiously, his tone completely shifting. "Those are incredibly serious accusations. Your daughter showed the judge medical records claiming you have advanced dementia." I walked over to my heavy mahogany dining table and picked up the thick manila folder I had spent the last 3 days meticulously organizing. Those medical records were signed by a boutique concierge doctor whom Brenda pays privately. I stated, handing the folder to the deputy. "If you look at the second tab, you will find a comprehensive neurological evaluation conducted by my own primary care physician 2 days ago. Mrs. Henderson scored a perfect 30 on her cognitive assessment. She has absolutely no cognitive impairment whatsoever." I watched as the deputy opened the folder. I had designed the layout for maximum impact, applying the same forensic accounting principles I use for corporate fraud cases. The evidence was presented chronologically, objectively, and devastatingly. The third tab contains a printed spreadsheet of Mrs. Henderson's trust accounts. I continued, my voice steady and methodical. "You will see 18 months of unauthorized wire transfers moving from the trust into a private LLC registered to Brenda's husband. She isn't trying to protect her mother's assets. She is liquidating them." Deputy Miller flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the highlighted bank routing numbers and the official cognitive assessment. He was a seasoned officer, and I could tell he immediately recognized the meticulously documented reality of the situation. The narrative Brenda had painted of a tragic, declining mother and a heroic, suffering daughter was disintegrating right in his hands. He closed the folder, let out a long, heavy breath, and looked back at me. This ex parte order was granted based on fraudulent information. He muttered quietly. Exactly. I replied. Brenda lied to a county judge to get that temporary conservatorship. She rushed the filing yesterday afternoon specifically because she knew we were gathering evidence. She wants to use your badge to physically remove her mother from my protection before the financial fraud can be exposed. She intends to force her into a private lockdown facility where she will have no access to a phone, an attorney, or her own bank accounts. If she leaves this house with Brenda today, she disappears. The deputy stood up slowly, tapping the folder against his leg. A temporary conservatorship order is still a legally binding document until a judge revokes it, he explained, his tone serious but sympathetic. I cannot simply ignore a signed court order based on a counterclaim, even with this evidence. However, given the severe allegations of abuse and the conflicting medical reports, I will not forcefully remove Mrs. Henderson from this premises today. I am classifying this as an active dispute, requiring a full evidentiary hearing. I felt a profound wave of relief, but I kept my face entirely neutral. We had successfully blocked her immediate legal strike. What happens now, Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice tight with residual anxiety. The deputy looked out the front window, where Brenda was pacing furiously on the porch, dialing her phone with aggressive, sharp jabs. Now, Deputy Miller said, I go outside and inform your daughter that I am suspending the extraction, but she is going to demand an emergency hearing to enforce the order. Lit here, I said, my voice hardening. Tell her that if she wants to execute that fraudulent order, she can meet us at her attorney's office tomorrow morning for a formal deposition before we take this to the probate judge. Tell her to bring her husband, the LLC owner, as well. I knew Brenda's psychology perfectly. She would agree to the meeting. She was too arrogant to back down, entirely convinced she could still intimidate us in a formal legal setting where she felt she held the power. The deputy nodded, handing the thick folder back to me. Keep these originals safe, he warned softly. I will file a preliminary incident report documenting the locking mechanism on the neighbor's house and the contradictory medical statements. But you need to be prepared. People who commit this level of systemic fraud do not surrender easily when cornered. Tomorrow morning is going to be incredibly volatile. He turned and walked back toward the front door, preparing to deliver the bad news to the woman waiting on the porch. I stood by the window, watching as the deputy stepped outside. I couldn't hear his exact words, but I saw Brenda's reaction. Her polished posture collapsed into frantic, rigid outrage. She pointed aggressively at my house, waving the useless court order in the air. The deputy simply shook his head, pointed toward his cruiser, and walked away. Brenda stood alone on my frozen lawn, her eyes locked on my window. She mouthed a promise to destroy us tomorrow. I just closed the blinds, ready for the final strike. The conference room in the downtown legal district was designed to intimidate. It smelled of expensive leather, stale coffee, and arrogance. Brenda sat at the far end of the massive glass table, flanked by a high-priced probate attorney and her husband, David. David looked visibly annoyed, checking his luxury watch, as if this forced meeting was merely a minor inconvenience in his busy schedule. They were completely unprepared for the reality of the morning. They thought we were here to negotiate a surrender under the pressure of their legal authority. Brenda's attorney, a man with a sharp suit and a condescending smile, opened the binder in front of him. He did not bother to introduce himself to me. He looked directly at Mrs. Henderson, speaking in a slow, patronizing tone. "Mrs. Henderson, your daughter is simply trying to execute a necessary medical transition. We have a judge's temporary order. If you continue to resist this conservatorship with the help of this neighbor, we will involve Adult Protective Services. It is time to sign the quitclaim deed and avoid a public humiliation." I did not let Mrs. Henderson speak. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out 3 identical manila folders, and slid them across the sleek glass table, one for the attorney, one for Brenda, and one specifically for David. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, my voice dropping to a quiet, clinical register. "Before we discuss any property transfers or medical transitions, I strongly suggest you review the financial accounting of the Henderson Family Trust. You are currently attempting to enforce a fraudulent conservatorship to cover up a felony." The attorney frowned, flipping open the folder. David picked his up with an indifferent sigh. But within 10 seconds, the color completely drained from his face. He was looking at a meticulously color-coded spreadsheet documenting over $200,000 in unauthorized wire transfers. Every single dollar had been moved from Mrs. Henderson's Protected Living Trust into a private shell company, an LLC registered entirely under David's name. I had traced the routing numbers, matched the timestamps, and attached copies of the original trust charter, proving the violations. "What is this?" David whispered, his voice cracking. He turned to look at Brenda, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror. "Brenda, what the hell is this? You told me your mother's account was legally paying us for caregiving expenses. You told me the LLC was just a tax strategy for her medical write-offs." Brenda's perfect, stoic facade shattered. She reached over, desperately trying to pull the folder out of her husband's hands. But he yanked it away. The polished alliance they presented to the world was instantly disintegrating. "It is a forensic audit," I answered calmly, watching the panic set in across the table. "As a certified fraud examiner, I have already prepared these documents for the county prosecutor's office. You haven't just mismanaged an estate. Brenda, you have committed systemic wire fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." The attorney abruptly closed his folder, pushing it away from him as if it were on fire. He was a probate lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney. He knew continuing to represent Brenda meant becoming an accessory to federal crimes. Brenda stood up, slamming her hands flat against the glass table. Her face was flushed, her voice shrill and trembling with desperate rage. "She is incompetent," Brenda screamed, pointing a shaking finger at her mother. "She has dementia. None of this matters because she is legally unfit to manage her own assets. I have the medical records to prove it. And the court gave me guardianship. I was protecting my own inheritance from a woman who doesn't even know her own name anymore. You cannot use those documents against me." I reached into my briefcase one last time. I placed the certified cognitive evaluation from a licensed neurologist in the center of the table, right next to a small, silver, flash drive. She scored a perfect 30 on her assessment. I said softly, letting the silence ring out before delivering the final blow. "And that flash drive contains security footage from my property. It shows you stripping her house of furniture, shutting off the heat during a winter freeze, and installing an industrial padlock on her exterior door. You didn't secure her. You imprisoned her. The silence in the conference room was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and entirely victorious. David dropped his head into his hands, realizing that his wife's greed was going to cost him his freedom, his business, and his reputation. The attorney stood up, packed his briefcase, and flatly informed Brenda that he was withdrawing his counsel effective immediately. Brenda collapsed back into her expensive leather chair. She looked at her mother, her eyes wide, waiting for the maternal forgiveness she had always relied upon to save her from consequences. Mrs. Henderson did not offer forgiveness. She sat tall, her hands resting calmly on the table. "You thought I would stay quiet because I loved you," she said, her voice steady and carrying the immense weight of a mother's broken heart. "You thought you could freeze the life out of me, and I would sign away my home just to feel warm again. But you forgot one thing, Brenda. You forgot that surviving your father's cruelty taught me how to survive yours. You are no longer my daughter. You are just a thief." We stood up and walked out of the conference room together, leaving Brenda sobbing loudly into the dead silence of the office, while her husband frantically dialed his own criminal lawyer. We didn't look back. By the end of the week, the temporary conservatorship was permanently dissolved by a furious probate judge. The county prosecutor filed formal charges for financial exploitation and unlawful imprisonment. Brenda's pristine white SUV was repossessed. Her massive estate was heavily mortgaged to pay for her criminal defense, and her perfect reputation was entirely destroyed. The neighborhood's reaction was a swift and brutal lesson in social dynamics. The very same people who had brought Brenda casseroles and praised her sacrifices suddenly pretended they had always suspected something was wrong. They whispered about the police cruisers that showed up at Brenda's estate. I ignored all of them. I had zero interest in their hypocritical gossip. My only focus was ensuring Mrs. Henderson's financial ecosystem was completely firewalled against any future claims or appeals Brenda might try to attempt from a courtroom in the coming years. Mrs. Henderson moved back into her home, but she did not return to the quiet, fearful life she had lived before. With the stolen funds fully recovered and returned to her trust, she hired a professional interior designer. She filled the house with bright, warm colors, heavy oak furniture, and life. The industrial padlock was removed, replaced by a beautiful, solid brass door handle that only locked from the inside. We often sat on her porch during the summer evenings, drinking iced tea and enjoying the profound peace of absolute safety. We are conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable sanctuary. We are taught that shared blood demands an endless supply of grace, and that setting a boundary against a relative is somehow a failure of love. But true love requires basic human respect. When someone uses the title of family to justify manipulation, abuse, and theft, they void the contract of kinship. You do not owe your life, your home, or your sanity to someone simply because you share a last name or a history. Silence is often misinterpreted as surrender. The world assumes that those who do not yell, who do not fight back publicly, have simply accepted their victimization. But sometimes, silence is a fortress. It is the necessary, quiet space where you gather your strength, assess the damage, and build the evidence required to dismantle the systems of power that seek to crush you. Surviving abuse is not about matching the abuser's volume. It is about outsmarting their arrogance with cold, undeniable truth and absolute patience. Healing from profound betrayal is never a soft or entirely painless process. It requires you to look directly at the ugliness of the people you once trusted and accept them for who they truly are. It demands the terrifying courage to step out into the freezing dark and refuse to be locked away by guilt. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to force you into the cold is to find a quiet neighbor, reach out your hand, and ask them to please stay until morning.